Okay. So, for the audience that does not know you, feel free to introduce yourself.
Hi there, I'm Seth Stern. I'm the Director of Advocacy at Freedom of the Press Foundation, a nonprofit organization that protects and defends public interest journalism.
Okay. So, one very big thing has happened recently, which we spoke about a little bit over email. So Julian Assange. So what happened exactly? Because what I was reading was that he reached a plea deal with the United States government, but it was like unclear, kind of like who was it? The Biden administration? Like, what happened? Why did this happen? Why it felt like out of the blue?
Yeah.
Where did this all come from?
Yeah, so he reached a plea deal with the Department of Justice to plead guilty to one count of violating the Espionage Act, the law that makes up for 17 of the 18 charges in his indictment. And press freedom organizations, as well as law professors, media publishers, and others, have long taken issue with his being charged under the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act criminalizes obtainment and communication of defense information. It doesn't say classified information even, it says defense information. That's because the Espionage Act is so old that it predates the classification system. And the problem with that is the breadth of it. Reporters obtain and disclose defense information and classified information every day. That's what journalists are supposed to do. And the First Amendment is supposed to protect their right to do so, as long as they didn't participate in the illegality themselves. The way the government tried to get around that with Assange was to say he conspired with his source, Chelsea Manning, to obtain the materials and thereby acted illegally. Problem is, the extent of the conspiracy was basically communicating with his source and asking his source for information. Again, what journalists do every day. Documents don't just fall out of the sky. Journalists go out and get them by asking for them. So we saw the charges as very problematic all along, as did a lot of other people. Finally, the case settled. It's good that there was a plea agreement as opposed to a trial, because a trial and a subsequent appellate court upholding an adverse trial verdict could lead to a binding legal precedent that allows for future Espionage Act and other prosecutions of journalists. But even though a plea deal doesn't create a binding legal precedent, it's still a problem because it validates the idea that journalists can be charged under the Espionage Act, prosecuted, and even convicted under the Espionage Act. And it's sure to embolden prosecutors to pursue similar theories against journalists, whether through the Espionage Act or through state law. We've seen incidents like what happened with the Marion County Record last year, where a newsroom was raided on some bogus theory that checking a government website violates a state law. Those kinds of theories are going to find validation in this plea deal. Prosecutors are going to say, well, if it was okay on the federal level with Julian Assange, why can't I enforce the laws of Kansas or Alabama or wherever in a similar way? So that's all very concerning, as we've made clear in our writings on our website, in The Guardian and the Daily Beast. And we're not the only ones. Plenty of people are making similar points about this. And, they could have had Assange plead to a computer fraud violation. That was the 18th count in his indictment. 17, Espionage Act. 1, a computer crime violation. Would that have been great? No, but at least in terms of the precedent it sets, it would be consistent with existing law that, sure, journalists are not allowed to hack into somebody's computer to get files. The law applies to journalists too. You can't break in, you can't hack, but at least it wouldn't be criminalizing mere obtainment and publication of information. And you asked how the plea deal came about. That is a good question. I don't think anyone quite knows, but there was an interesting Washington Post report that came out either late last week or early this week. And I think the takeaway there was that after last month's hearing in the UK, at which the UK High Court allowed Assange's appeal of his extradition to proceed, and did not accept the US's assurance that the First Amendment would provide him adequate protection in American courts. The UK had asked the US to provide that assurance, and the US worded it in this kind of weaselly way that, well, Assange can assert that he is protected by the First Amendment, and it'll be up to a judge whether he actually is. Well, I can come to court and assert that I'm a giraffe, and it's up to the judge whether I actually am. It's meaningless. You can assert anything in any court. The U.S. tellingly was not willing to expressly say Assange would be protected by the First Amendment, and the UK High Court noticed that. It allowed his appeal to proceed. It seems like that was probably a development that the administration didn't expect, that took a lot of people by surprise. And after that happened, it motivated folks to proceed with the plea deal that previously it had declined to proceed with. The Washington Post reported that the UK lawyers that were representing the US before the High Court were pushing to end the case. Even some of the prosecutors at the Eastern District of Virginia who were working on the case wanted a plea deal, but there was resistance. It's not clear exactly who led the resistance, but up until that court ruling last month, or well, I suppose now it's July, in May, in the UK, there was resistance to the plea deal. I think that verdict, it sounds like, changed things and opened up the possibility of this resolution.
So, with your work as an organization, and you specifically, since you're the director of advocacy, you lead effectively anything that's just advocating for journalists in the organization. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, well, we do a combination of public-facing advocacy, whether it be op-ed writing, speaking engagements, social media, publications on our own website, as well as sort of behind-the-scenes advocacy, calling lawmakers, working with activists at the community level when there's a case that requires local leadership, and doing, what we can to shape policies and practices in a manner that is useful for press freedom and calling attention to situations that might be flying under the radar. Our organization is uniquely positioned for advocacy purposes because we operate the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which is a news site. It's sort of a database that documents press freedom violations around the country, ranging from assaults of journalists, arrests of journalists, subpoenas of journalists, and other prior restraints and other categories of press freedom violations. So being that we have this news site operated in-house that is documenting these instances, it sets us up to be able to advocate for the same people, the same journalists that the tracker is often reporting on. We also develop software tools like SecureDrop that are, tools that allow journalists to receive documents from sources confidentially. We have a digital security training team that trains journalists around the world on protecting their digital security and their privacy. So those other teams that are under the Freedom of the Press Foundation umbrella have a nice synergy with our advocacy team. We get to see these incidents as they occur. We get to hear about the latest in digital security for journalists from others at the organization. I think your characterization of what we do is pretty much accurate. I am the director of advocacy. I work with our deputy director, Caitlin Vogus, very closely, and our executive director, Trevor Chin. Although he's got a hand in everything at the organization, he's also involved in our advocacy operations, and specifically with the Assange case, since it's been going on for so long. Before we had a full-on advocacy team, Trevor was leading efforts there.
So does your organization have like direct contact with Assange? Like, are you guys communicating with him all the time, or how does the relationship work?
No, we're not really communicating with Assange at all. I've never spoken to him. I don't know whether Trevor might have met him once or twice, but we have no real relationship with Julian Assange, the individual. Our focus is on the press freedom implications of his prosecution. He's a very polarizing figure. Some people love him, some people hate him. Our position has always been none of that matters because the law under which he is being charged criminalizes, as I said, obtaining and communicating defense information. And the precedent set the precedent that would have been set by a conviction and the message sent by the plea deal does not distinguish between Julian Assange and a journalist at the New York Times. You'll hear a lot of people say, well, Julian Assange didn't redact names. Julian Assange dumped all these documents wholesale. He didn't engage in the kinds of journalistic practices and ethical practices that typical journalists engage in. Maybe so, but the charges that he faced didn't hinge on that. The charges he faced could easily be used against any journalist, the most ethical journalist in the world, who checks their sources 1,000 times and redacts virtually everything sensitive, is equally vulnerable to those charges. What the administration is essentially saying is, trust us. We will use our prosecutorial discretion responsibly. We will only pursue cases like this against the Julian Assanges of the world. We will not pursue cases like this against New York Times and Washington Post reporters. And even if you trust the present administration to draw that distinction, which frankly I don't, do you trust a potential Trump administration to draw that distinction? Do you trust future administrations we can't even predict now to draw that distinction? I don't think it would be naive to have that trust. Once government asserts powers, it usually uses them. And unless there is something in the law that mandates a distinction between the Assanges of the world and the New York Times of the world, they're unlikely to make such a distinction themselves. And there shouldn't be anything in the law that distinguishes between different kinds of journalists anyway. Journalistic ethics are something for professors to debate, not judges. So our take is that the government should be entirely out of the business of criminalizing routine journalistic conduct, regardless of any handshake deal to only do so in cases like Julian Assange's. But no, we're not agents of Julian Assange. We're not lawyers for Julian Assange. We're not affiliated with him in any way. Like there are organizations out there that are more interested in him personally, see him as a hero, see him as the greatest journalist in modern times, and talk a lot about the implications of the case for him specifically. And those organizations are doing their thing. They're operating in that lane. That's not our lane. We really take no position on whether Julian Assange is a good journalist or even a good person. We're concerned solely with the implications for press freedom of his prosecution.
So now, looking at the organization itself that you have a very big hand in, the Freedom of the Press Foundation, has there been any attacks on the organization itself, or things that might have occurred, like it could be anything, like maybe members of the staff being surveilled or monitored, or maybe requests from governments that might have been a little bit questionable? Like, what have you seen maybe against the organization itself, if anything?
Yeah, I've only been here for a couple of years, so I can't speak historically to whether that's ever occurred. I'm not aware of any such events. I mean, look, we people come after us on Twitter and social media all the time, but if you're talking about the government coming after us specifically in some way, no, not that I'm aware of. I don't think that the government particularly wants to be publicly opposing a press freedom organization, if there's any way to avoid that, that probably would not be a great look. And, we haven't given them any reason to. Everything we do is entirely constitutionally protected. We're advocating for legitimate policies that, in our view, are not only are entirely consistent with First Amendment rights. And I don't think our positions are that extreme. I think a lot of constitutional scholars agree with what we stand for. So yeah, short answer is no. But there's always one issue that I've called some attention to lately is the attack on nonprofits generally. There's been some legislation floated that fortunately has not passed yet, but did pass the House, that would essentially allow the Secretary of the Treasury to unilaterally rescind nonprofits' tax-exempt status by calling them, supporters of terrorism. But none of the standards for material support of terrorism apply. That is concerning to not only nonprofit advocacy organizations, but news organizations, especially given some of this misguided rhetoric coming mostly, but not entirely, from the right, that support for, let's say, pro-Palestinian causes or criticism of the Israeli government can be read as supporting terrorism, I guess, because Hamas, which is a designated terrorist organization, is also critical of the Israeli government. So by the theory goes, I suppose, by agreeing with a terrorist organization about something very general, you are supporting them. And there have been attacks on journalists specifically. So that's concerning for us, not only for our own sake, but for the sake of the journalists we advocate for, who we want to be free to criticize the Israeli government, to explain the Palestinian perspective, and vice versa. We want them to be free to report from whatever perspective and they feel fit, and wherever the facts lead them. So those sorts of attacks from the legislature are concerning. But if you're asking, has it happened yet? No, it's just something we've always got to be on the lookout for.
So now, looking at the big picture of like some of the goals of the organization and what you guys are trying to work towards now, other than Assange, which we just touched on, what other things are are you guys trying to focus on at the moment?
Well, we're currently hiring for a position called the Daniel Ellsberg Chair on Government Secrecy. Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers whistleblower, who died last year at age 92. He's one of our co-founders, longtime board member, and we established this position to really further his legacy, continue his work in combating excessive secrecy, overclassification at the federal government level. I think there are a lot of people out there who don't realize how essentially meaningless it is these days for a document to be classified. Practically everything is classified. There's an assumption out there that anything that is classified is carefully chosen to be classified because its release would seriously endanger national security. Not the case. Documents are really classified by default at many levels of the federal government, and that impedes transparency, impedes news gathering by journalists, leads to prosecutions, including under the Espionage Act, of people ranging from whistleblowers to Donald Trump, almost Joe Biden as well. So the overclassification system is a major concern that we want to deal with, specifically once we have hired and gotten the Dan Ellsberg Chair on Government Secrecy up and running. We think there's a great need for advocacy organizations to be focused on lack of transparency within the federal government, and to work with policymakers to finally make some changes that will allow the country to live up to its ideals when it comes to transparency and press rights. Aside from that, a major priority of ours is trying to get the Press Act passed. The Press Act is a federal reporter's shield law that would prohibit the government, except in emergency situations, from subpoenaing or surveilling journalists to learn the identities of their sources. It would also prohibit the federal government from seeking journalists' source communications through phone and internet and technology providers. 49 states recognize the reporter's privilege at the state level. The federal government does not. That makes it very difficult for journalists to meaningfully assure their sources of confidentiality, which ultimately means sources don't come forward and the public is deprived of newsworthy information. So that is a very important piece of legislation that has a chance of passing. It passed the House unanimously. It's supported in the Senate on a bipartisan basis. It's in the Senate Judiciary Committee, where among its co-sponsors are both the highest-ranking Democrat on the committee, Dick Durbin, and the highest-ranking Republican on the committee, Lindsey Graham. So we're optimistic about that bill's passage, and we're trying to do everything we can to get it through. Of course, particularly in this election season and with the war going on, safety of reporters covering protests is a priority for ours. Reporters are frequently arrested and assaulted by law enforcement at protests, and we're both reacting to those incidents and attempting to get the message out that it's not acceptable for that to occur. A lot of law enforcement officers operate under the assumption that if they're entitled to disperse protesters from a protest, for example, because certain protesters were breaking the law or because there's a curfew, that they can also stop journalists from filming or documenting what's happening and arrest them if they do. Not the case, according to the federal courts and the Department of Justice. Having cause to disperse protesters based on alleged illegal activities does not mean that you're entitled to disperse journalists who are lawfully doing their jobs. The aftermath of a protest, including after a dispersal, is in and of itself newsworthy, oftentimes more newsworthy than the protest itself. So journalists are entitled to cover those situations without being impeded by law enforcement, as long as they are not causing a danger to the police, as long as they're not obstructing the police. They are well within their rights to document those protests. And that's, again, with the war, the situation on college campuses as of late, the political conventions coming up, that's something we've certainly got our eyes on.
So looking at the journalists themselves that you guys have, covered and helped and, worked in advocacy for, what are some of the attacks from governments you've seen on them, if any?
Well, when you say journalists we work with, we're advocating for press freedom as a whole. We might work individually with a particular journalist after something has happened to them, but we're not like a trade association that is working day to day with a particular group of journalists. We're looking out at what happens in the world and responding. Some of the incidents as of late, of course, a lot of people have heard about what happened at the Marion County Record, and we see that as sort of emblematic of the decline of press freedom in the United States. You've got these police officers who either don't know or don't care that raiding a newsroom is constitutionally problematic. You've got a judge who issues a warrant without regard for the Privacy Protection Act, which is supposed to protect against raids of newsrooms and seizures of journalists' equipment. And you've essentially got an entire law enforcement coalition ranging from the local police department to the prosecutor's office to people at the county level who just seem unbothered by the notion that a journalist's newsroom can be raided, their equipment and files seized for a crime that amounts to verifying a news tip using public records on a government website. Similarly, there was a case in Alabama last year, in Atmore, Alabama, where a journalist who reported on a grand jury proceeding was charged under a grand jury secrecy laws. Grand jury secrecy laws on their face apply to the grand jurors themselves, people with access to the grand jury. They do not restrict journalists from publishing what their sources tell them, nor could they do so. Constitutionally, they can't do that. That's journalists are entitled to publish lawfully obtained information. Not only were those journalists arrested, but they were, as a condition of bail, gagged from talking about their case or any criminal cases. So those are a couple instances where we're just seeing prosecutors and judges show ignorance or disregard to First Amendment protections for journalists. We've also been active on the Tim Burke case in Florida. He's the journalist who obtained the recording of Tucker Carlson's interview with Kanye West, where Kanye West went on an anti-Semitic rant. He was indicted for violating computer fraud laws, even though, according to him at least, he obtained that information on the open internet. He did not need to hack into any computers to get it. And the DOJ's position is that his files, his news gathering materials, are contraband, and that he is not entitled to use them. So we see that as highly problematic. There was a case involving Ben Camacho, a journalist in Los Angeles, where the city sued him in 2 different courts for publishing information the city itself had given him. Again, an absurd legal theory under the Constitution. Both lawsuits were thrown out, but it took a lot of time and money on Ben's part, and really has a chilling effect on the press when journalists are forced to expend their time and money fighting these bogus cases. And we're just seeing a lot more of that nationwide. We're seeing a lot of, in the past, when authorities came after journalists, whether or not we thought the charges were legitimate, there was at least some legal reasoning, some pretext behind it. Now we're seeing these just really off the wall, blatantly unconstitutional cases being filed against journalists all across the country. And those are just, a few examples.
So I've had many people on my show, I don't know if you've seen some of my other videos, but one of the people that I interviewed was Sarah Adams, who led the Benghazi investigation in the United States. She's a former CIA targeter and analyst, and I asked her about Edward Snowden and how she felt. And I also saw an interview with Andrew Bustamante, who's a famous former CIA officer, and they both made similar comments about Edward Snowden. When I asked them, which was, I asked them, I'm like, how do you feel about them? Or I asked Sarah, how do you feel? And her response was essentially that the way that he did everything, the way that he leaked the documents, was a selfish manner, number one. And she said that he leaked a lot of other things other than just U.S. surveillance, and that he only leaked 1% of the documents. And he really just bought a ticket for every country that he was going to go to. And eventually he ended up in Russia, because I think he went to Hong Kong first, and he was there for a little while. But her point was just that Snowden did it in a very selfish and egotistical way, as opposed to just leaking as opposed to, going to like the office of the inspector general or, a lawmaker to try and get rid of this. And that was her criticism, was that the method that Snowden did it, and that his motives were egotistical, selfish, and that he had other routes. Those are her, I believe those are her exact words, were, other routes, other paths to take, as opposed to just immediately going and leaking the documents first. And I'm sure that you've likely heard these criticisms before of Snowden, between the fact that he leaked a lot of sources, or that, or at least that's what she claimed, and all these other things. And ultimately, his goals were not, or rather, his methodology was not entirely pure and not 100% right. So, what are your responses to people that are saying things like that, and the former CIA people that say things like that?
Right. I think with whistleblowers, it's often convenient for the government to focus on personalities and motives and subject them to some sort of purity test that they make sure includes elements that they know the specific person won't satisfy, as opposed to focusing on the public good served by the leaks. And that's what we're more focused on. And I don't think it's really debatable that it was in the public interests to learn about the NSA's surveillance. That continues to be a topic that is debated between policymakers and the public to this date. I wish I could say that it had led to more meaningful reforms, but at least it's led to a discussion and a public awareness. So to me, it's kind of pointless and gossipy to speculate about Ed Snowden's motives and whether you like him, whether you hate him. The point is that he indisputably served the public good through what he did, and whether he did that because it gratified his own ego or whether he did that for altruistic reasons, I happen to think the latter, but who cares? The documents are what they are, and that's what we should be focused on. When Daniel Ellsberg, who I mentioned earlier, died, there were a lot of sort of takes from the media about how Ellsberg was lionizing Ellsberg. He's the last of the pure whistleblowers. He did things the right way, and everyone since him did things the wrong way. And he's on this pedestal, and Ed Snowden is not. And he, faced the music and went to let him and face trial for what he did. And Ed Snowden didn't. And all these people, attempting to make this distinction and sort of whitewash history. There was one good whistleblower named Daniel Ellsberg. He's dead now, and there can never be another good whistleblower. It's too bad they didn't start researching those takes while Ellsberg was still alive, because had they asked him, he would have said, that is absolutely not how I see things. He was a huge admirer of the Edward Snowdens, the Chelsea Mannings, the other whistleblowers that came after him. He thought they did things exactly right. He fully understood why someone wouldn't want to face trial under the Espionage Act these days, because there's no defense under the Espionage Act. He wasn't acquitted under the Espionage Act. Charges were dropped due to prosecutorial misconduct. Had the case gone forward, he very well would have been convicted, because although a murder defendant can explain why they did it, an Espionage Act defendant can't. It is irrelevant in court under the Espionage Act that one acted to serve the public interest or did serve the public interest. You're treated just the same as a whistleblower as you would be if you were a spy for a foreign adversary. In Ellsberg's time, he was able, at least while he was awaiting trial, to continue his activism, to spread his message, to raise awareness of the Pentagon Papers. In modern times, that wouldn't be the case. Someone would be locked up, probably in a maximum security facility pending trial. So it's a different world now. Some whistleblowers attempt internal methods first, some don't. Ellsberg, in his last interview in Politico, advised whistleblowers not to bother with that, because when you attempt to raise these issues internally, all you are is flagged as a troublemaker. And it's really not not worth the effort, given the current obstacles that whistleblowers who attempt to raise issues internally are facing. I think that is very much up to, that determination is up to individuals to make. People are coming forward at great personal risk to expose wrongdoing. If they feel it's beneficial to go through official channels, they can do that. If they don't feel it's beneficial, that's their judgment and they live with the consequences. But to deem it egotistical or whatever, to do things in the way that you believe as a whistleblower acting out of conscience is going to be most effective, no, I don't buy that. And I guess the last point I would make is that virtually every time someone blows the whistle, whether it's Chelsea Manning in the Assange case, Snowden, even the Discord leaker last year, who sure wasn't a whistleblower, but as I said, focus on the documents, not the person. These leaks come out, and very predictably, you've got a bunch of government and intelligence and military people who go on TV and say the sky is falling and they've created this great risk and troops are in danger and our national security is in danger. And that gets a lot of publicity. Of course, when you have people going on TV and saying alarmist stuff, the media is going to pick up on that and report it. When none of that happens, that's not as newsworthy. Then media doesn't report what doesn't happen. So you've got this situation where you have a lot of noise about how the sky is falling when there's a leak, and then 6 months later, nobody reports that the sky didn't fall because, yeah, I get it. That's not news that the sky didn't fall. The sky doesn't fall every day. But you've got this sort of rinse, repeat, one-sided picture where these bogus claims and exaggerated claims that all this damage has been done get airtime, and then the reality that follows doesn't.
What's one of the things that you've learned about how governments operate when it comes to? Sorry if I'm talking slowly. I'm just trying to there's a lot of echo with the audio, but I was going to say that when it comes to how governments are operating towards journalists, right? There's this, let's just say the three biggest governments in the world: Russia, China, and the United States, right? Now, between those three, right? Like Russia has had a history of, in the case of Snowden, right? They have protected this guy and gone out of their way to protect him. And I think for the effort of, basically mocking the United States, right? And also benefiting from, just in general having, it's a power play, right? But I was going to say that between those three governments, right, between the United States, Russia, and China, and how each of them operate towards journalism and journalists, right? Like, what have you learned about how governments, especially big ones, operate in some of their protections, trying to prevent whistleblowers and trying to, prevent any sort of internal discourse from getting out, right? Like, how are they towards truly groundbreaking journalism? Like the difference, maybe just any government, really, any big government. What have you learned about those discourses between them and journalists that you've commonly seen?
Yeah, well, although we're certainly critical of the U.S. government when it comes to press freedom, and believe that the U.S.'s global standing on press freedom is greatly diminished, we're not the only ones. Reporters Without Borders has the U.S. ranked 55th globally on press freedom this year. I think for a lot of people who don't follow press freedom as closely might expect that we're in the top 10 or even top 5, where the United States, we've got the First Amendment. But no, we've really ceded that ground as a leader on press freedom. That being said, though, I would not compare our situation to the situation in Russia and China. We do have a First Amendment. We do have legal protections on paper and oftentimes in practice that allow for vocal dissent. That allow for imprisonment of journalists to be a rarity and not an expectation, not a norm. So I don't want to draw any equivalencies between the way we do things and the way places like Russia and China do things. Sorry about the Slack knock. I thought that was silenced. But that being said, we have to be vigilant in ensuring that we don't slide to where those other places are. And once we establish these adverse precedents, once we stop demanding our public officials, our judges, our law enforcement officers protect press freedom, it can be a pretty slippery slope towards, getting to where Russia and China are. The ban of TikTok pursuant to a statutory authority that would allow further bans of foreign platforms, foreign-owned, even news sites that are deemed to be damaging to U.S. national security, spreading foreign propaganda. That's illustrative. China has banned foreign online platforms for that reason for a long time. We make a choice here not to do that because we value the public's ability to ultimately discern what is real and what is foreign propaganda and make informed decisions. And we recognize that process is not a clean one and can lead to difficulties and can lead to misinformation. But on balance, we value free speech, at least for now. What we're trying to do is avoid the further decline in that department. And that's why, with something like the Julian Assange case, getting back to that, we pointed to the inconsistency in the U.S. attempting to advocate for Evan Gershkovich, an American journalist for the Wall Street Journal who is imprisoned in Russia on sham espionage charges, while simultaneously prosecuting an Australian publisher, whether you call him a journalist or not, under our own Espionage Act for charges that have nothing to do with espionage. Not equating the two situations, not equating the Biden or even Trump administration to Putin's Russia, but saying that when we inch in that direction, we undermine our own credibility to draw those distinctions between ourselves and authoritarian regimes abroad.
So to wrap it all up, what do you think? Let's just say we're king of the world for a day, right? What ultimately needs to change worldwide? If you could make one ultimate big change to journalism globally, right, or at least what you think needs to be brought to the attention of people, what needs to ultimately be changed, from everything you've learned, everything you've gathered, and everything you've experienced in this, what do you think ultimately needs to be changed and made different worldwide with regards to journalism, just in general?
An understanding of the role journalists play in democracies is essential. I think that understanding has been lost in large part due to a decline in local journalism for economic reasons, mostly. People, no matter how they felt about the national or international media, historically they've respected their local paper. That speaks about issues that are near and dear to them, that they can relate to and that they can see play out with their own eyes. Now, so many people, when they hear about journalism, they're thinking about sensationalist stuff that they see on cable news, or they're thinking about some article that someone sent them on social media entirely out of context. So they see one piece from the Washington Post about X and Y without realizing that there is a broader universe of coverage the Washington Post has published on related issues. Objectivity, assuming that you even see that as an ideal, which people disagree over, but the idea isn't for every single article to paint a fair and balanced picture of all of history. Articles have word counts. The idea is for the coverage in its entirety to be fair and balanced. And that's lost when people are not subscribing to any one news outlet, not monitoring any one news outlet's coverage every day. They're seeing this article here, this article there, sent to them through social media algorithms. So people are just losing their appreciation of the role of journalism. People are cynical towards the idea of the free press of journalism. That's what needs to change. And if that were to change, it would, I think, lead to greater respect for journalists' rights on the part of law enforcement, judges, police officers, and others. And it would also lead to a greater willingness to the public to support journalists and journalism economically, because ultimately, that's the biggest fright. We're on the right side. Our advocacy work is mostly focused on journalists' rights and legal protections. But if there are no journalists, because every newspaper goes bankrupt, then journalist rights sort of become an academic issue. Rights are only worth anything if there's someone there to exercise them. So just as important as what we do is solving the economic crisis that newsrooms are facing. And I think step one to solving that economic crisis is public awareness of the importance of journalism, the role that it plays in our democracy, and where we would all be without it.
All right. I think that's a good place to end off, both for time reasons and because I want to talk to you a little bit after the show.
Sure.
But do you have any final words? Anybody listening?
No, it's been a great conversation. Thanks for having me on, George. And if you want to find out more about our organization, we're at freedom.press. And you can find us on X, Instagram, Threads, all the Mastodon, essentially all the major social media outlets. But great to be here.
Of course. Yeah, and you're welcome back anytime. All right, I'm going to stop recording now. And we'll talk after the show in 3,